In 1975, BMW made a decision that could have ended everything. They killed the 2002. Not because it failed, not because it was slow, not because customers stopped loving it. They killed it because they had to move forward. And moving forward is dangerous when you're standing on something that works. The BMW 2002 had saved the company in the late 1960s. It gave BMW identity. Compact, driver-focused, sporty without being flashy. It made the brand feel alive. So when BMW announced a replacement, expectations weren't reasonable. They were brutal. The new car would be called the 3 Series, internally coded E21. At the time, nobody knew what 3 Series meant. Today, it defines the brand. But in 1975, it was a gamble. BMW wasn't a giant company yet. It wasn't untouchable. The oil crisis had shaken the industry. Fuel prices were unstable. Customers were cautious. And BMW's entire future depended on getting this next step right. The E21 didn't look revolutionary. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was sharp, compact, focused. The front end leaned slightly forward, what would later be called the shark nose. It wasn't accidental. It was intent. Inside, something subtle happened. The dashboard angled toward the driver. That decision seems normal now. But in 1975 it was. BMW was quietly telling you, this car is for the driver first, passengers second. But there was tension. Replacing the 2002 meant risk. The 2002 was raw and mechanical. Simple. Direct. The E21 had to feel modern without losing that connection. If BMW softened it too much, enthusiasts would revolt. If they made it too aggressive, mainstream buyers might hesitate. They had to balance evolution and identity. And balance is harder than reinvention. When the E21 launched, reactions were cautious. It was cleaner, more refined, more composed at speed. But some purists asked, is it too polished? Has BMW lost its edge? What they didn't realize was this. The E21 wasn't trying to shock the world. It was trying to build a foundation. BMW didn't just need a replacement. They needed a platform. Something scalable. Something expandable. Something that could grow. Under the hood, the familiar inline-4 carried over in early versions. But soon, something bigger arrived. Inline-6 power. Smooth. Balanced. Refined. That combination would become a BMW signature for decades. The E21 wasn't louder than the 2002. It was smarter. It introduced structure, clear naming, clear positioning, clear direction. This wasn't just a car. It was the beginning of a system. In 1975, no one said, this will define BMW for the next 50 years. But that's exactly what happened. The E21 created the template. Compact sports sedan, rear-wheel drive, driver-focused cockpit, Balanced proportions. Accessible performance. It didn't explode into headlines. It quietly set the rules. And quiet revolutions often last longer than loud ones. The question wasn't whether the E21 was good. The question was whether it was strong enough to carry the weight of a brand. Because BMW was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting for identity. And identity is fragile. The first generation 3 Series wasn't perfect. But it didn't need to be. It needed to establish direction. And once direction is clear, momentum becomes possible. When the E21 launched in 1975, most people saw it as a successor. A cleaner 2002. A slightly more refined compact BMW. But BMW wasn't just replacing a car. They were standardizing an idea. And that idea would quietly define the brand for the next 5 decades. First, the naming system. This was the first time BMW formally introduced the 3 Series badge. That number wasn't random. It created hierarchy. 5 Series above it. 7 Series above that. Now BMW had structure. And structure builds clarity. Customers finally understood where a car sat in the lineup. It sounds small, but small decisions build empires. Then came something even more important. Balance. The E21 wasn't just rear-wheel drive. It was weight distributed for feel. It wasn't oversized. It wasn't underpowered for its class. It was calculated. BMW engineers weren't chasing dramatic numbers. They were chasing response, steering feedback, chassis composure, throttle control. That focus separated BMW from competitors who were chasing comfort or economy alone. And then the inline-six arrived. When the 320i and later 323i versions appeared, something shifted. The smoothness of BMW's straight-six engine became part of the car's personality. Refined but eager. Balanced but willing. It didn't shout. It flowed. And that engine configuration would become one of BMW's defining traits for decades. The E21 also introduced something subtle but powerful. Driver positioning. The angled dashboard. Clear gauges. Tight cabin layout. This wasn't accidental ergonomics. It was philosophy. BMW wasn't building cars around passengers. They were building them around the driver. That message spread. By the late 1970s, the E21 was selling consistently across Europe. Then North America. It wasn't explosive. It was steady. And steady growth stabilizes companies. BMW's image began sharpening. Not luxury first. Not economy first. Driver first. Motorsport added credibility. Although the E21 wasn't born as a full motorsport icon, it carried racing influence. The Group 5 turbocharged racing versions demonstrated what the platform could become under pressure. Aggressive aero. Serious power. Purpose-built aggression. Even if customers never drove those versions, the association mattered. It proved the chassis had depth. Meanwhile, competitors were watching. Mercedes-Benz focused on comfort and engineering prestige. Audi was experimenting with identity. Japanese manufacturers were rising rapidly. BMW had to hold its space carefully. And the E21 allowed them to do it without overextending. By the early 1980s, something was clear. The E21 hadn't just replaced the 2002. It had restructured BMW. The 3 Series became the core of the brand. Affordable enough to attract young buyers. Serious enough to earn respect. Sporty enough to feel special. And that's when momentum began building. Because when you get the formula right once, you can refine it. The E21 wasn't dramatic. It was disciplined. And discipline builds dominance. When the next generation arrived, the E30, it would explode in popularity. But the E30 didn't appear from nowhere. It stood on the E21's foundation. The first 3 Series wasn't flashy. It wasn't revolutionary in appearance. But it quietly established a DNA strand that still runs through BMW today. Compact proportions, rear-wheel drive, balanced handling, driver-focused cockpit, inline-six smoothness, clear model hierarchy. It wasn't trying to be iconic. It was trying to be correct. And sometimes being correct is more powerful than being bold. The E21 didn't save BMW in dramatic fashion. It stabilized BMW in strategic fashion. And that difference is what allowed the brand to grow without losing itself. By the late 1970s, the E21 was established. It had structure. It had identity. It had steady sales. But it also had critics. And critics matter. Because they reveal where a brand is vulnerable. The first complaints were subtle. Some drivers felt the suspension was too firm for daily use. Others believed the rear end could feel nervous at the limit. Early 4-cylinder versions weren't as charismatic as the 2002 they replaced. Purists said the car felt more restrained, more controlled, less raw. And that wasn't entirely wrong. The 2002 had been mechanical and direct. The E21 was cleaner, more disciplined, more engineered. But that refinement came at the cost of some of the old chaos enthusiasts loved. Then there was practicality. The rear seat space wasn't generous. The cabin felt driver-focused, which was intentional but not spacious. BMW wasn't building a family car. They were building a sports sedan. But not everyone wanted that balance. In North America, emissions regulations also affected performance. Engines were detuned. Power figures dropped compared to European versions. Some buyers expected more punch, especially when competitors were beginning to experiment with turbocharging and new technologies. So the E21 faced a quiet challenge. It had to prove it wasn't just a transitional car. It had to prove it could evolve. BMW responded not with drama, but with tuning. The 323i arrived with more authority. Stronger inline-six power. Improved balance. More personality. Now the E21 felt complete. Not raw like the 2002, but more mature. And maturity is dangerous territory. because maturity can feel boring if not handled carefully. BMW had to make sure refined didn't mean forgettable. Interestingly, the E21 never became the cultural icon its successor would. It didn't explode into pop culture. It didn't dominate posters. It didn't define an era visually. And that might have been its greatest advantage. Because without the pressure of being a superstar, the E21 could quietly do its job. It built loyalty. It built structure. It built consistency. And it prepared BMW for something bigger. If the E21 had tried too hard to be dramatic, it might have fractured BMW's identity. Instead, it held the line. It absorbed criticism. It refined itself. It improved without losing balance. By the early 1980s, something subtle had happened. The 3 Series name meant something. It wasn't experimental anymore. It wasn't fragile. It was dependable. And dependable platforms allow brands to take bigger risks later. The E21 didn't need to be the loudest generation. It needed to be the stabilizer. And stabilizers rarely get headlines. But they make the next leap possible. Without the E21's lessons in refinement, emissions tuning, chassis balance, naming structure, the next generation would not have succeeded the way it did. And that next generation would become legendary. The E21 wasn't perfect. But perfection wasn't its mission. Its mission was continuity. And continuity builds empires. By the early 1980s, BMW was no longer uncertain. It had clarity. The 3 Series had structure. The inline-six had identity. Rear-wheel drive had purpose. And the market understood what BMW stood for. But here's the important part. That clarity didn't come from the E30. It came from the E21. When BMW began developing the second-generation 3 Series, the E30, they weren't inventing a concept. They were refining one. The formula was already established. Compact body, driver-first cockpit, balanced chassis, accessible performance. The E21 had tested that formula globally. It absorbed criticism. It proved durability. It confirmed demand. That allowed BMW to go further the next time. The E21 also trained buyers. That sounds strange, but it's true. It taught customers what a 3 Series should feel like. Steering feedback. Weight distribution. A car that rotates under throttle. Not front-wheel drive safety. Not soft luxury float. Something precise. Once customers expect precision, a brand can build momentum around it. And then something important happened. Motorsport division began sharpening its presence. While the E21 itself wasn't born as a full M icon, its chassis and engineering discipline laid the groundwork. When the E30 M3 arrived later, it didn't appear from nowhere. It emerged from a system, a structure, a philosophy that began with the E21's clarity. By the time the E21 ended production in 1983, over 1.3 million units had been built. That number mattered, because it meant the 3 Series wasn't niche anymore. It was core. The car that replaced the 2002 had become the backbone of the brand. Competitors noticed. Mercedes-Benz sharpened the 190e. Audi refined its Quattro identity. Japanese manufacturers began experimenting with sportier sedans. But BMW had something different. Continuity. The E21 didn't chase trends. It defined direction. Looking back, it's tempting to celebrate the louder generations. The E30 with its M3 glory. The E46 with its balance. The E92 with its V8. But none of those chapters exist without the first three series being disciplined enough to hold the line. The E21 wasn't dramatic. It was strategic. It stabilized BMW after the 2002 era. It created naming hierarchy. It introduced model clarity. It strengthened inline-six identity. It reinforced rear-wheel drive purity. And most importantly, it created expectation. Once a brand establishes expectation, it must meet it. BMW did. For decades, the E21 wasn't the loudest BMW ever built. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most collectible. But it was the most important transition. The car that replaced a legend and quietly became the foundation for another. The BMW E21 didn't try to dominate its era. It built the rules that BMW would follow for the next 50 years. And that's why it still matters.